I absolutely loved Walking with Dinosaurs. It was a brilliant show and a fantastic technical achievement, bringing the prehistoric world of the Mesozoic era to life for audiences across the planet. It was one of the main things that first got me fascinated by paleontology and the science of the natural world when I watched it as a young child, a fascination that has never left me. One of the best things that came out of the success of Walking with Dinosaurs has got to be the various specials that were released in the early 2000s, including the wonderful Ballad of Big Al, as it was called here in the UK, or simply Allosaurus, a Walking with Dinosaurs special, as it was known in the US. Now that I have reviewed the scientific accuracies and inaccuracies of the entire original series of Walking with Dinosaurs, it's time to tackle this special, and then eventually Walking with Beasts, the other specials, Walking with Monsters, and even Walking with Cavemen. The Ballad of Big Al follows a slightly different format to the original 6 episodes, and tells the story of a single real specimen of Allosaurus based on what paleontologists have been able to determine from its skeleton. It's a brilliant and quite inspired way to make an episode, using the injuries that are visible across the skeleton of Big Al to construct a possible dramatised life story about this individual. It's also accompanied by a dedicated half-hour making-of episode called Big Al Uncovered, which goes into great detail about the scientific evidence that many aspects of the special are based on, which again is absolutely fantastic and is something that I really appreciate about it, showing the actual work that's been done and how paleontologists know many of the things they do about Big Al. Of course, the Ballad of Big Al did come out over 24 years ago now, and paleontology is a fast-moving science, so there are still lots of things that are now out of date and inaccurate. But that's what we're here for, to celebrate the progress of science and to show appreciation for these amazing shows that shaped a generation's love for paleontology. So let's get into it. What are the scientific accuracies and inaccuracies of the Ballad of Big Al? We'll begin with the main star of the episode, Allosaurus, and more precisely the species to which the Big Al specimen belongs to, Allosaurus jimmadseni, a newer species named in 2020. Previously, it had been thought that Big Al was a member of the original type species Allosaurus fragilis, first named in 1877, but numerous differences in the shapes of the skull bones and other parts of the body indicate that these are separate species. For example, a pretty easy way to tell the skull of Allosaurus jimmadseni apart from fragilis and the other currently valid species, Allosaurus europaeus from Portugal, is with the shape of this bone here, the jugal. In jimmadseni, the bone is quite flat along the bottom, whereas in the other species, it dips down a lot more towards the back. Allosaurus jimmadseni lived slightly before Allosaurus fragilis, only being known from the lower geological member of the Morrison Formation and all of its similar aged equivalents. So this does mean that the stated date of 145 million years ago for this episode's setting is a little too young, and Big Al actually would have lived between 157 and about 153 million years ago. So, how is this episode's overall portrayal of the appearance of Allosaurus? Well, they actually used different models for Allosaurus in this special than they did for episode 2 of Walking with Dinosaurs, and they managed to improve parts of the anatomy compared to these original reconstructions. Most noticeably, the crests on top of the head are actually placed in the correct positions now, just in front of the eyes, rather than above them. They also portray the low crests that run along the tops of the nasal bones from just in front of the other crests all the way to the edge of the premaxillary bone, which is seen in the fossils but was missing from the older reconstructions. So definitely some good improvements there. The overall shape of the skull also seems to be a little bit better and closer to what we see in the fossils. But again, it does look a bit off, with the snout having a very gentle slope that doesn't look quite right, and it should really have a slightly longer snout, giving it a more rectangular profile shape. The snout also seems perhaps too broad and rounded, and should probably come to a bit more of a point. The back of the head is also a little too deep, and like most of the Walking with Dinosaurs designs, it suffers from the trend of shrink wrapping. That is, not adding enough soft tissue to reconstructions of prehistoric animals, resulting in outlines of bones and openings in the skulls being visible, whereas in reality they were probably not particularly obvious in the live animal. The rest of the body seems pretty decent, though maybe it could do with a little bit more soft tissue to beef it up a tad. Another of the prevalent issues throughout older reconstructions of dinosaurs is the orientation of the forelimbs, which in theropod dinosaurs could not have been pronated, with the palms facing backwards, the infamous bunny hands. Instead, they would only have been able to orient them with their palms inwards. In some of the shots, it looks like there may be a little bit of hand pronation, but generally in this episode they're actually kept facing inward, so it's not the worst case of this in paleomedia. We can also say a little bit about the skin texture of Allosaurus now, as a few impressions of this dinosaur's skin have actually been published. I mentioned in my Walking with Dinosaurs episode 2 review about the possibility of feathering an Allosaurus, and how although it's highly speculative, it's not impossible that these dinosaurs had some kind of feathery integument present, since it seems to have been a fairly widespread feature among dinosaurs. However, it's understandable that they would not be reconstructed in the Walking with Dinosaurs models, and in modern paleoart you still generally tend to see mostly featherless Allosaurus, with maybe some quills present. The Allosaurus skin impressions that have been published include 2 specimens with traces near the shoulder region, showing relatively small pebbly basement scales. And then there's also a trace from around the base of the tail that shows larger scales that are polygonal to subcircular in shape. This might therefore indicate regional differences in scale size and ornamentation. But it's also possible that the larger scales came from a sauropod instead, as sauropod scales are known to look like this, and many fossils of these dinosaurs are also associated with this Allosaurus specimen. Then there's also another Allosaurus specimen that preserves traces of very small pebbly scales over part of the mandible, and then broad, scute-like scales in the region of the throat, associated with the 4th and 5th neck vertebrae, though they haven't yet been officially illustrated or described. The Allosaurus model in the episode does seem to incorporate lots of small pebbly basement scales over most of the body, which is good. And there are also parts of the body where the scales seem to get a little larger, showing some interesting variation that may have been present in the real animals. I love all the details of the different scale types on the physical animatronic of the head too, even if the arrangement is speculative. Looking at the feet, there are some very obvious much broader scales running down the tops of the toes and foot, a scale type known as scutate scales, similar to what's seen on the feet of many modern birds. Although we don't yet have direct evidence for this type of scale anatomy on Allosaurus specifically, traces of scutate scales are known in fossils of other theropod dinosaurs, so it seems to have been a widespread feature of these dinosaurs and may indeed have been present in Allosaurus too. The discovery of another Allosaurus specimen with preservation of skin traces around the legs, hips, chest and neck was also announced last year, so it seems like we'll be learning even more about the life appearance of this dinosaur in the near future. This brings us to another of the contentious topics with reconstructions of theropod dinosaurs, the infamous lip debate. I've made a whole video about this debate before, specifically focusing on T-Rex, but to summarise, there is increasing evidence to suggest that instead of theropod dinosaurs such as Allosaurus having exposed teeth like a crocodile when their mouths were shut, as is the case with the Big Al reconstruction, they had a condition more like lizards such as Komodo dragons, in which extraoral soft tissue structures would have concealed the teeth. So based on what we know now, it seems probable that Big Al should not have had such a toothy grin. Another thing worth mentioning again that I've discussed in previous episodes is the flexibility of the theropod tongue, which in most Walking with Dinosaurs reconstructions is shown to be very mobile. However, research published in 2018 has since shown that these dinosaurs would have had hyoid bones, the bones that anchor the tongue muscles, more like those of living crocodilians instead of the complex hyoids of birds, and as such would have had fairly immobile tongues. Some ornithischian dinosaurs such as the ankylosaurs were found to be an exception however. So Big Al wouldn't really have been capable of curling its tongue like it's shown doing a few times in the episode. The coloration of the Allosaurus in this episode is obviously entirely speculative, but I do like it and it seems fairly reasonable. And it's another very iconic Walking with Dinosaurs design, especially with the stripes of black. I also like the striking red coloration of the crests above the eyes, which is mentioned in the episode as turning this colour once sexual maturity is reached. Sexual display does indeed seem to be the most likely function of these crests in these and other dinosaurs, so drawing attention to that with the colour is a great detail. There's also the detail of the reddish patch just behind the eyes, which reminds me somewhat of the tympanum of frogs. But I hope that's not what it's supposed to be, since dinosaurs have ear canals that were positioned further back than this, just behind the quadratojugal bone. But considering that it's also shown to be a reddened structure, I assume it's meant to be another hypothetical sexual display feature. Several baby Allosaurus individuals are also shown in the episode, and although we don't have any published fossils of hatchling Allosaurus, there are some slightly older juvenile remains known for this dinosaur. One of these is the so-called Little Al specimen that was auctioned a few years ago and is currently on display at the Dinosauria Museum Altmühltal in Germany, and which I've been fortunate enough to see for myself. This is said to be the youngest Allosaurus individual that's ever been found, being about 2 years old at the time of death. Uncovered in 2011 in Wyoming, it has yet to be scientifically described, but hopefully it can tell us a lot more about what these animals were like as juveniles. Another specimen of juvenile Allosaurus is a partial but associated skeleton that preserves most of one of the hind limbs, and when compared to the dimensions of older Allosaurus specimens, paleontologists found that this juvenile had proportionally longer legs. This likely would have enabled these youngsters to run faster than adults, probably helping them to take different, smaller and more nimble prey items as juveniles, and so avoid larger and more dangerous animals. This long-leggedness as juveniles does seem to be reflected in the models of the hatchling Allosaurus, which all appear to have proportionally very long and unwieldy looking hind legs. The rest of the design is obviously pretty speculative and suffers from a bit of shrink wrapping and hand pronation again, but I like that the crests have yet to develop, and the coloration seems to be very inspired by ostrich chick colours, which is a cool detail, as these patterns aid in breaking up the outline of the babies and therefore helps them avoid detection by predators. The episode begins by showing the hatching of Big Al, and also portrays the mother Allosaurus as engaging in parental care, at least for the first few weeks of life. This is a reasonable behavioural inference, given that the majority of living birds engage in caring for their offspring by incubating them and feeding them, and the fact that the other living branch of the Archosaur lineage, the crocodilians, also care for their offspring suggests that this was a widespread feature in all Archosaurs, which includes the non-bird dinosaurs. Making inferences such as these based on the living relatives of the extinct species is a method known as phylogenetic bracketing, which basically means you look at the living lineages that split off on either side of the extinct lineage to infer the likeliness that a certain trait existed in those extinct species. We also do have direct fossil evidence for parental care in various groups of non-bird dinosaurs, including theropods in which the parents are preserved in bird-like brooding positions over clutches of eggs. Although we don't have specific evidence for Allosaurus itself, the reproductive behaviour shown in the episode is discussed in the making of, and is based on fossil discoveries made in Portugal. The Lourinhã Formation of Portugal is a very similarly aged deposit to the Morrison Formation, and also contains a remarkably similar dinosaur fauna, including their own species of Allosaurus, Allosaurus europaeus, which I mentioned earlier. Well, in addition to many body fossils of dinosaurs, the Lourinhã Formation has also produced some spectacular fossilized eggs, and was claimed to have been the site of a few different species' nests. These eggs have not been identified as belonging to Allosaurus specifically, instead being associated mainly with Lourinhãnosaurus, which might be an Allosauroid, but has a somewhat controversial classification history and still seems to be a bit of a mystery. Another egg clutch from the formation has also been associated with Torvosaurus, which is a megalosaurid known from both Europe and North America. Still, considering that there's a European species of Allosaurus known from this formation, it's possible some of the eggs could have been from this animal. Altogether, one of the sites that's been particularly well studied preserves at least 73 complete or partially complete theropod eggs, which are grouped in 4 to 6 clusters. Looking at the porosity of the eggshells, scientists have been able to calculate the rate of water loss through the shells, finding that these eggs must have been buried in sediment and could not have been exposed to the air, or they'd lose too much water vapor. So similar behaviour to modern crocodilians that nest in mounds. And this is indeed how the Allosaurus nests are portrayed in the episode, and the narration even mentions the holes in the eggshells. So I have to once again compliment this episode for explaining some of the science that went into the reconstructed behaviour. Recent work published in 2024 has since shown that the Portugal site is probably not actually a nesting ground, and is more likely a secondary accumulation of eggs that were washed from elsewhere during a flood. Still, the actual burial of the eggs in a nest would nevertheless have occurred. These ones were just unfortunately swept away later. The episode shows the newly hatched Allosaurus as having teeth already, and this is indeed supported by what's found in these Portugal egg sites, since the embryonic skeletons of the little theropods do indeed preserve teeth, showing that they came out of their eggs fully equipped. The mother of Big Al is also shown breaking into the nest mound in order to help her babies hatch. And this is another behaviour that, while it's entirely speculative, is something that some modern crocodiles and alligators have been documented doing. Upon hearing the sounds of their offspring, female crocs will open up their nests to let the young out. And they have even been known to take non-hatched eggs into their mouths to gently help the eggs break. Despite their fearsome reputation, crocodilians really are very good parents. So showing Allosaurus engaging in such behaviour is another nice detail. Kenneth also mentions in the narration that smell is important to Allosaurus, and from the moment mother and hatchling smell each other, they form a bond that is crucial for the hatchling's early survival. Although a lot of work on crocodilian parental hatchling recognition has focused on how they identify each other with vocal signals, recognition through odours may also play a role in this, and many birds are also able to recognise parents and hatchlings using scents. So once again, we can use phylogenetic bracketing to infer that dinosaurs such as Allosaurus may indeed have relied a lot on smell to recognise their offspring too. The special also talks a lot about growth rates in Allosaurus, as we follow the life of Big Al from hatchling to subadult. A lot of research into the growth speed of Allosaurus has been done by examining the cross-sections of limb bones which display growth rings, kind of like tree rings, enabling the rate of bone growth to be studied. Looking at several different Allosaurus specimens, paleontologists have found that this dinosaur had somewhat variable growth rates, with different individuals growing at different speeds, likely determined by food availability in their environments. However, the chronology of Big Al's life as depicted in this episode is a bit off, for a few reasons. First of all is the fact that, spoilers, Big Al is shown to die at age 6 or possibly 7, but it now seems that Big Al lived for at least 16 years. This information is based on an abstract for a conference talk that happened in 2022, so there's no full study on this yet, but hopefully there will be soon. One of the other very interesting things mentioned in this abstract is that the limb bones of Big Al were noticed to possibly have medullary bone, a bone type only seen in female birds and other kinds of dinosaurs that forms during the egg-laying period. So Big Al might have been female. I've seen people suggesting that we should probably rename her as Big Alice in this case. I think that works pretty well. The identification of this bone type is not yet 100% certain though, and we'll have to wait for the actual study to be published to find out more. But it does seem that Big Al survived much longer than is portrayed in the episode, and might also have raised her own offspring before dying. One of the other issues with the episode's growth chronology is the slightly weird mistake of saying that Big Al was 10 meters in length at the time of death, when the Big Al specimen only measures about 7.5 to 8 meters. I'm not sure where they got the 10 meter value from, but oh well. It's far from the most extreme size overestimation in Walking with Dinosaurs, Liplorodon. This brings us to one of the other controversial topics concerning Allosaurus, the existence of a possible giant relative of the dinosaur called Saurophaganax maximus. This species was originally described in the 1940s, and it also comes from the Morrison Formation, being unearthed from rocks of this formation in Oklahoma. Saurophaganax is only known from relatively incomplete and disarticulated remains. It had previously been thought to be a particularly large allosaurid that coexisted with Allosaurus itself, potentially reaching over 10 meters in length, and I made a whole video on it back in 2018. Well, some very recent developments have cast significant doubt on the existence of this animal as its own distinct genus. In December of 2024, paleontologists published research demonstrating that some of the bones originally assigned to Saurophaganax, in fact, seem to be from a sauropod dinosaur. Some of the other bones are still most likely from an allosaurid though, so the paleontologists made the decision to name the allosaur material as a new species of Allosaurus itself, Allosaurus anax, while they say that the name Saurophaganax maximus should refer to an as yet undiagnosed species of sauropod. The episode itself doesn't mention Saurophaganax, so there's nothing more to really say about it, but I thought it was worth mentioning this recent scientific development. And good job to the episode for just staying out of this controversy too, I guess. Allosaurus is said to reach sexual maturity at 6 years old in this episode, but more recent work has found that age 10 is more likely to be when this occurred. Similarly, despite being shown to take about 6 to 8 years to get to adult sizes in the episode, it appears that it was only sometime around the age of 22 that these dinosaurs would reach complete skeletal maturity. Although the exact timings given in the episode are a bit off, it is correct in saying that Big Al itself was not fully grown at the time of death, as the skeleton of this dinosaur clearly had a bit more to go before reaching its full size. The episode also accurately shows the rapid early growth of the young dinosaurs. They just seem to get a bit too big too quickly compared to what we now understand about Allosaurus growth. I think the reason that Al is shown to die at about 7 years old is because that's how old one of the paleontologists working on the fossil speculated Al was, but that was presumably before any actual analysis of the individual's age was done. The Ballad of Big Al portrays a lot of Allosaurus hunting and feeding behaviour, showing a diverse range of different prey types for Big Al over the course of his life. The change in niche as Al grows, feeding on invertebrates and small vertebrates when young, and then being able to take on much larger prey in life, is of course something we see in various modern animals and is something that's also been proposed for extinct dinosaurs, most notably Tyrannosaurus rex. It's also been investigated for Allosaurus itself, although the full research on that isn't published yet. One thing that's not shown in the episode, and for which Allosaurus has since become quite well known, is the hypothesized hatchet mode of feeding for this dinosaur. This idea had its origins in a paper published just after the Big Al special aired, in February of 2001, based on examining the structure of Allosaurus' skull and how the different bones responded to the stresses inflicted by feeding. The hypothesis suggests that Allosaurus would open its mouth very widely and then bring its top teeth down on its prey like a person wielding a hatchet. This was supported by the findings that the skull of this dinosaur was over-engineered and could resist stresses much greater than the calculated biting force of the jaws alone could impart. However, this hypothesis has since been heavily critiqued by several studies, which suggest that the apparent over-engineered state of the skull simply allows these dinosaurs to better resist the forces generated by struggling prey items. The particularly wide gape of Allosaurus may also have simply been a way to allow these dinosaurs to feed on very large-bodied prey, such as sauropods. Another paper examining the way Allosaurus fed found that the species would have pulled at flesh in a more similar fashion to birds of prey than to crocodilians. It was shown that Allosaurus had musculature suited for retracting its head backwards while ripping at flesh, instead of shaking its head from side to side. The episode does do a good job showing them feeding in quite a bird-like style, especially when they're eating the Diplodocus on the salt plain, and the animations do mostly show a retraction of the head when they pull at the carcass. Talking of the salt plain scene, there's a lot I want to compliment about this whole sequence. First of all, the whole thing is just so awesome to watch. Benjamin Bartlett really didn't need to go that hard with the score, but I'm glad he did, as it really adds to an incredible sequence, showing what must have been one of the most insane spectacles in the history of life on our planet. Giant theropods taking down giant sauropods. I also really love how the sauropods are portrayed as deadly animals in their own right. These were massive, formidable creatures, easily capable of defending themselves and causing some serious harm to the much smaller theropods. So, rather than the gentle giants trope that you often get in a lot of paleo media, we get to see these dinosaurs as the dangerous beasts they really would have been. Accordingly, the Allosaurs are very cautious in their hunt, working to weed out an old, sick, and therefore less dangerous individual to take on. The way that Allosaurus individuals come together to form a loose association purely for this one hunt is another very interesting bit of speculative behaviour to depict. As I've talked about in previous accuracy reviews, propositions of pack hunting behaviour involving complex mammalian-style social structures have been heavily disputed in dinosaurs such as dromaeosaurs, the raptors, and tyrannosaurs. But an alternative style of group hunting that's been hypothesized for some dinosaurs is one that's more similar to Komodo dragons and crocs, in which they are mostly solitary hunters but will occasionally come together to tackle prey items as a group. So again, although it's speculative, it seems like reasonable hypothetical behaviour for these dinosaurs, collaborating to exhaust their chosen Diplodocus, but then the pack structure essentially breaking down as soon as they all get their fill. Another nice bit of behavioural detail is the arrival of the giant female Allosaurus that bullies the others away and steals the sauropod kill. This is indeed a behaviour that's seen in modern large predators, notably among lions, and we do have fossil evidence of possible scavenging in Allosaurus too. The size of this gigantic female Allosaurus is given as 4 meters longer than the other Allosaurus. At this point in the episode, Big Al is stated to be 9 meters long, so that would make this individual about 13 meters in length, significantly larger than the biggest Allosaurus specimen known, which has been estimated at just under 10 meters, although larger estimates have been given in the past. I don't know if this Allosaurus was meant to be a hint at Saurophaganax or not, but it's also not unreasonable to say that there were some particularly giant individuals of this already pretty large theropod species, since there would have been a lot of variation in dimensions across all the Allosaurus individuals that ever lived, and the chances that we found fossils of the single biggest one to ever exist are next to none. This might also be the result of the scientific advisors for the episode interpreting the fossils assigned to Saurophaganax as very large, old female Allosaurus individuals, but I'm not sure. Speaking of scavenging behaviour, the episode also depicts a predator trap that lures a couple of unfortunate Allosaurus individuals to their deaths, as they are attracted to a sticky mud pit by the stench of a decaying Stegosaurus. In the accompanying Big Al Uncovered episode, it's inferred that this is based on the Cleveland Lloyd dinosaur quarry in Utah. At this locality, an unusually dense assemblage of dinosaur bones has been uncovered, representing at least 70 individuals of at least 9 different species. 46 of these individuals are Allosaurus, meaning there's a striking imbalance of many more predators than prey items in this quarry. As such, the idea of this being a predator trap does make sense, since it would naturally attract many more meat-eating animals to the site compared to herbivorous ones. However, other hypotheses for the accumulation at the Cleveland Lloyd site suggest that the presence of many skeletons may be due to periods of extreme droughts forcing all these animals together at a shrinking water source, or that a mass death occurred as the result of a poisoned spring. Some of the most recent research into this site has shown that the bodies preserved in the quarry were most likely transported here by storm and flood conditions after the animals had died somewhere nearby, and that there were actually multiple such flood stages. So they didn't actually all die here at once, and going by this evidence, a predator trap scenario seems less likely. Nevertheless, although the Cleveland Lloyd quarry may not have been a predator trap, such things likely could still have occurred in the Morrison environment, so showing this in the episode is not necessarily inaccurate. Plus, as I mentioned previously, there is indeed some evidence of scavenging in Allosaurus, so they could certainly have been attracted to some lovely rotting carcasses. Early on in the episode, we also see a year-old Allosaurus predating on one of Big Al's unfortunate recently hatched siblings. Remarkably, we do indeed have some potential evidence for cannibalism in Allosaurus. At another quarry preserving numerous dinosaur skeletons near the Utah-Colorado border, there's evidence of Allosaurus bones with feeding traces possibly made by other Allosaurus individuals. So this is another very plausible behaviour to depict. The Big Al Uncovered special also details some of the evidence used to inform the depictions of Allosaurus feeding behaviour in this episode, and talks about studies done on the anatomy of the Allosaurus brain. It states that Allosaurus hunting behaviour was more like an alligator than a bird, as their brains had a large sensory information gathering region and a small information processing region, meaning it would essentially snap at anything that looks right. So bite first and ask questions later. This is indeed still considered to be the case, with subsequent studies on the structure of Allosaurus's brain noting it to be more similar to crocodilian brains rather than bird brains. Big Al Uncovered also goes into some detail on the metabolic rate of Allosaurus and other dinosaurs, particularly focusing on the anatomy of the heart. In fact, it even features the controversial fossil known as Willow, a specimen that was claimed to preserve a heart. Willow is a Thescelosaurus, a small herbivore unrelated to Allosaurus that lived a long time after the Jurassic, and in 2000 it became very well known due to the claims that a concretion in the chest cavity of this specimen preserved the remnants of 2 ventricles and the aorta. This seemed to indicate that this non-bird dinosaur had a 4-chambered heart like a bird or mammal, and therefore had an elevated metabolic rate like these other animal groups too. However, more recent studies that further examined the Willow specimen have cast doubt on the claim that it's a heart, and it appears more likely that it's just a concretion. Still, Big Al Uncovered does mention that the supposed heart structure was still under scrutiny at the time. So, although this part of the making of episode hasn't aged very well, it makes sense that they'd include this fossil, as it was very big news at the time, and seemed to nicely illustrate the warm-bloodedness of the non-bird dinosaurs. Of course, the metabolic rate of dinosaurs is still an ongoing topic of discussion among researchers, though the evidence points to most groups of these animals having had elevated metabolisms compared to modern reptiles. One of the other particularly great parts of this episode is the way it depicts how Big Al got many of the injuries that are preserved across its skeleton. Poor old Big Al is a particularly beat up dinosaur, with at least 19 distinct injuries clearly present on various bones. Now, I actually did my undergraduate research project for my paleontology degree on a specimen of Ichthyosaur that preserves some pretty nasty injuries. And throughout the research process, I couldn't help but feel very sorry for this individual, as I imagined how it got these pathologies and then went on surviving for some time afterwards, presumably in a great deal of pain. So it really gave me a new appreciation for the Big Al special and the way it reconstructs the violent life of this particular specimen, as I became quite attached to my poor Ichthyosaur. Maybe one day I can convince the BBC to make an episode about my specimen. Anyway, Big Al has 5 injured ribs all on its right side, and at least 3 of these were most probably caused by a violent impact. Al survived the impact though, as there are distinct bony calluses where the rib fractures re-healed. The episode depicts Al as suffering these particular injuries when he gets a bit too close to a larger female who's not interested in his advances. Some violent intraspecific combat follows, and Al gets his ribs smashed, his claw ripped, and his arm torn. Big Al's skeleton does indeed also show a finger bone on the right hand that seems to have been twisted during life, although the injury higher up on the arm, on the right scapula, is a lesion with an uncertain cause, so it might not actually have been inflicted during a fight. Al is also shown at a few other points in the episode as getting bashed about a bit, explaining various of the other injuries present in its body. One of the most prominent pathologies in Big Al's skeleton is the swollen bony growth on digit 3 of the right foot. The episode shows Al suffering this injury during a failed hunt, where he trips and falls badly, breaking the toe. 2 months later, he's then shown with a nasty infection on the toe, which is indeed consistent with the fossil evidence which indicates that this infection lasted several months, considering the amount of bone deposition present. The episode ends with this nasty infected toe and Al's overall poor malnourished condition, ultimately contributing to the dinosaur's death. This is also something that's supported by the fossil evidence, as in the publications discussing Al's pathologies, it's said that the infection on the right toe would have been accompanied by severe swelling and tenderness, so that the whole toe would have been inflamed so much that it was pressing against the other toes. So walking would have been very painful for Al, and almost certainly impacted this dinosaur's effectiveness at obtaining food. The portrayal of Big Al's resting place in a dried up riverbed during an arid season is also consistent with the fossil evidence. Al lay on its left side, and the soft tissues of the body likely desiccated in the heat, as Al was discovered in a classic death pose, caused by drying ligaments pulling the head and neck backwards over the body. The left side of Al's body is better preserved than the right side, and would have been rapidly covered by sediment after death, while the right side may have been exposed for a few weeks to months since some of these bones are scattered. There are also signs that some of the bones were bored into by scavenging beetle larvae. Eventually, over the course of several flooding events over many weeks, the body of Big Al was completely covered. So overall, the death of Al is accurately portrayed according to what we understand from the fossilized bones of this ancient predator. Although Allosaurus is the star of the show in this episode, we also see lots of the other animals that Allosaurus jimmadseni would have coexisted with in the Morrison formation. These include the sauropods Apatosaurus and Diplodocus. Overall, the reconstructions of these sauropods are pretty similar, which of course makes sense considering these are both members of the family Diplodocidae, and also looks like another case of reused models. However, there are differences in the coloration, the presence of spines, and some body proportions. I also appreciate that the episode doesn't just feature only one kind of diplodocid, since the Morrison formation is famous for its impressive diversity of long-necked dinosaurs, so it's nice to see at least a little bit of variety. We've discussed the neck posture of these sauropod dinosaurs in previous episodes. Throughout Walking with Dinosaurs, diplodocids are depicted with horizontal necks, as the scientific advisors working on the show favoured this interpretation of their neck posture as the most probable. However, some more recent studies have argued that sauropods such as Diplodocus and Apatosaurus would in fact have held their necks more upright, as they examined various living animals and found that the way in which they tend to flex their necks results in a neutral pose above the horizontal plane when applied to sauropods, especially when soft tissues of the neck are considered too. The beefiness of the necks of these Apatosaurus reconstructions is actually not too bad. It looks as though they are a bit more robust than the necks of the Diplodocus, at least from certain angles, which is indeed accurate to the fossils known of these dinosaurs. Although to be honest, they could probably do with even more chunky necks. Apatosaurus necks were much thicker than their diplodocine relatives, with bulky neck vertebrae that have ribs which extend much further downwards and to the sides. This robust construction, along with the fact the ribs had distinct knobs at the ends, has even led paleontologists to hypothesize that apatosaurs might have engaged in combat with their necks, similar to what giraffes sometimes do, a hypothesis that came to be known as brontosmash. Another of the striking proportional differences between Apatosaurus and Diplodocus is that the tail of Apatosaurus significantly decreases in height just after the hip region, as the spines of the vertebrae suddenly get much shorter, whereas in Diplodocus the spines shorten more gradually. From what I can tell when comparing the sauropod models used in the episode, at certain angles it looks like this difference in tail anatomy has been incorporated into the reconstructions, but then at other times they look pretty much the same. The base of the tail should therefore bulge quite a bit more than it does here in Apatosaurus. It also looks like the ribcage of Apatosaurus is deeper than in the Diplodocus models, which is indeed the case with the real animals. But again, that might just be certain angles. The depiction of Diplodocus with spines along its back and Apatosaurus lacking them is, I suspect, mainly used as a way to easily distinguish the species in the episode. As I mentioned in my Time of the Titans review, there is evidence for Diplodocids having some spines, but although they were initially thought to be associated with Diplodocus itself, they have since turned out to be from other diplodocines. Still, as its close relatives seem to have had spines, it's arguably reasonable to depict Diplodocus with dermal spines as well. I must also mention the anatomy of the feet of these dinosaurs, as sauropod feet are very unusual, but they often get depicted as being more like an elephant's. This seems to be the case with the Walking with Dinosaurs depictions of both Diplodocus and Apatosaurus. In reality, the hands are made up of quite pillar-like metacarpal bones arranged in a semicircle. Plus, in these species, there are enlarged claws on the innermost digits of the hands. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like any of this is depicted in the Walking with Dinosaurs models. The models also show the sauropods with their external nostril openings up on top of the head, where the nasal opening is on the skull. This is something you tend to see in many older reconstructions, but research done in the early 2000s showed that the external fleshy nostrils would still have been positioned at the front of the snout, not overlaying the bony opening. A third sauropod species makes a brief appearance in this episode too, Brachiosaurus. Again, it's a good way of showing the sauropod diversity in the Morrison, with lots of different species of long-necked dinosaurs all living here. I talked a lot about the Brachiosaurus model in my Time of the Titans review, and again it shows some of the issues common to many Walking Dinosaurs models with a bit of shrink wrapping, especially of the skull. The nostrils are also placed high up on the head away from the snout. Plus, the feet are again not really very sauropod-like, although they're mostly obscured in the few shots of this animal in the episode. It's also important to note that when this episode was produced, Brachiosaurus was still considered a transcontinental genus of dinosaur. The North American species Brachiosaurus altithorax was the first to be found, but then there was also Brachiosaurus branchi uncovered in Tanzania, Africa. The African Brachiosaurus was known for much more complete material compared to the North American one, and so many of the reconstructions you see of Brachiosaurus are in fact based on the anatomy of this species. But then in 2009, the African species was deemed different enough to be placed within its own genus, and so it's now known as Giraffatitan branchi. It was also shown to differ from the American Brachiosaurus in various body proportions, with Brachiosaurus actually having a longer and deeper torso, a longer tail, and possibly slightly sprawling forelimbs, though the length of the neck was probably about the same for both dinosaurs. So these Walking with Dinosaurs Brachiosaurus models are likely based more on Giraffatitan than what we actually know of Brachiosaurus, since at this point in time they were still thought to be members of the same genus. We also get another appearance from Ornitholestes this episode, which again I discussed previously in the Time of the Titans review. This design incorporates a distinctive nasal horn that was considered to have been present in this species for a time, based on an erroneous interpretation of the skull of this dinosaur. As it turns out, such a nasal crest was likely not present in life, as the skull had just been deformed slightly during the fossilization process, making it look as though there might have been the beginnings of such a structure. But hey, at least it's made to look very bright in this reconstruction, reflecting its visual display function, even if it didn't really exist. The design also still has those quills down the back of the neck, which again is at least an attempt to show some feathering in these theropods, although really the whole animal would most likely have been covered in feathery integument, considering that Ornitholestes is a Coelurosaurian dinosaur, and so is related to other lineages that had feathers. Also, this is a bit of a tangent, but I'd been wondering why the design for these dinosaurs includes this bright blue triangular stripe around the eye leading down to the jaw. It's certainly distinctive, but I recently realised that it's likely based on an illustration by paleontologist Greg Paul published in 1988, which illustrates a tree-climbing Ornitholestes sporting an extensive feathery coat. Looking at the face, there's almost the exact same shape around the eye, so clearly Walking with Dinosaurs took some inspiration here. Perhaps this is also why Ornitholestes is the only non-bird dinosaur in the series to have some form of feathery integument, as this is a pretty early depiction of an almost fully feathered non-bird theropod. Anyway, I just thought that was interesting when I spotted the similarities. The iconic Stegosaurus makes another brief appearance in the Ballad of Big, both as live individuals and as a delicious stinking carcass. It looks like the CGI model used for the living Stegosaurus in the special is identical to the model from Time of the Titans, and so all the inaccuracies I discussed previously are carried over here. This includes the oversized plates, which appear a little bit larger compared to the actual largest plate fossils known for these dinosaurs, and proportionally shorter necks and tails than they should really have. Of course, the bony cores of the plate would have been covered in a keratinous sheath that extended them in life. But these models' plates still seem to be a bit too extreme in proportion to the rest of the body. Another inaccuracy is that the Stegosaurus model apparently has an incorrect number of toes on the forelimbs. Stegosaurus had 3 toes on its back feet and 5 on the front feet, but there are seemingly only 4 toes on the front in the Walking with Dinosaurs model. But overall, it's not a terrible model, and a lot of those proportional differences have only been revealed in the past decade or so with the discovery of more complete Stegosaurus skeletons. It's also interesting to note that the largest known specimen of Stegosaurus, an individual called Apex, which was uncovered in 2022 and sold at auction in 2024 for a record-breaking price, apparently has plates that look very small for its body size, as well as weirdly long legs. It's not yet known what species exactly it might belong to, but it'll be interesting to see what we learn from studying the specimen. So it's possible that Stegosaurus actually had pretty variable body proportions. The physical model used for the dead Stegosaurus in the mud trap appears to be slightly different from the CGI model. Most notably, the plates are proportionally smaller. Based on the discovery of articulated and more complete Stegosaurus skeletons, such as the one nicknamed Sophie, which is housed at the Natural History Museum in London, it's now understood that the plates along the neck would have been arranged more closely to being one after the other, before they split into 2 rows down the back. However, in the Walking with Dinosaurs design, the neck plates are fully paired up and form 2 distinct rows. Another thing we can now definitely say is inaccurate about the physical Stegosaurus model is the skin texture. In the episode, it looks like it's been given rather elephantine skin, being very wrinkly, and you can't really see any scales. However, we do have some fossilized impressions of Stegosaurian skin, so we know they would have had a ground pattern of many small polygonal scales with much larger oval tubercles interrupting them in certain places. A very cool skin detail that the models do include are these rounded bumps on the underside of the neck. These represent the gular armor, bony throat armor that's been found with Stegosaurus fossils, which acts almost like chainmail to protect this vulnerable part of the dinosaur. It's another fantastic bit of attention to detail that shows the work that went into some of these reconstructions. So our understanding of this iconic Jurassic dinosaur has improved significantly in the time since the Ballad of Big, making this reconstruction fairly dated now. But that just shows the remarkable progress the science of paleontology has made over the years. Next up, a small herbivorous dinosaur that's named as Othnielia makes an appearance in the episode 2, alongside one of the Stegosaurus individuals. Now, for various taxonomic reasons that I won't go into, Othnielia as a genus name is today no longer recognised as valid. Instead, the fossils once called Othnielia are labelled as Nanosaurus. However, these naming revisions occurred a while after the episode aired, in 2007 and then again in 2018. It appears this is another case of Walking with Dinosaurs reusing the same dinosaur models but with different colour schemes, as the Nanosaurus designs appear to be almost identical to the Leonosaurus CGI models from Spirits of the Ice Forest, the Thescelosaurus in Death of a Dynasty, and the Dryosaurus models also featured in the Ballad of Big plus Time of the Titans. Interestingly, despite looking like a small ornithopod, which is what Dryosaurus is, Nanosaurus has been recovered in recent phylogenetic studies as a basally branching Neornithischian, meaning it's actually not particularly closely related to the ornithopods. These models in the episode look overall fine for being somewhat generic small bipedal herbivores, and from the fossils that are known of Nanosaurus, the body shape of the model is fairly close. The legs might need a little more bulk, and the forearms are also pronated, which is incorrect. I think maybe the bodies should be a tad stouter and the tails perhaps a little longer, but those are fairly minor issues. There's also the possibility that Nanosaurus might have possessed some feathery filaments, but considering that Walking with Dinosaurs was reluctant to feather the theropods, there was no chance we were getting any ornithischians with feathers. Plus, it wasn't until 2014 that Colindrodromeus was discovered, the first ornithischian dinosaur preserved with feather-like integument. I do like the colour scheme used in the episode for Nanosaurus, with some stripes to break up the animal's outline and brightly coloured heads, presumably hinting at a display function. Although, if they were needing to hide from predators, I guess they'd have to stick their heads in the ground or something. The models used for Dryosaurus, which again are suspiciously similar to the Nanosaurus ones, are also mostly alright, but could maybe do with slightly longer tails, and the hands are pronated when they should be oriented with palms facing inwards. Again, there's a case for Dryosaurus having some feathery filaments too. The colour scheme for these dinosaurs is less distinctive, but looks functional for breaking up the body outline. It's fun to see the scattering behaviour of these animals when Al attempts to hunt them the first time, and I love how bold some of them appear when they realise he can't catch them, turning around and making defiant squawking noises. Although I'll never forgive them for being responsible for Al's foot injury in that last hunt. They knocked down that tree stump on purpose, I swear. Moving next to the non-dinosaur animals featured in the episode, we get another look at the incredibly cursed Anurognathus design that we last encountered in Time of the Titans. I think I pretty much said it all in my review of that episode, but to summarise again, this is not at all what the pterosaur Anurognathus looked like. Just compare the Walking with Dinosaurs design to a reconstruction based on the actual fossils of this animal, and you can see what I mean. As I said before, it's a shame we didn't get a more accurate Anurognathus considering how strange yet adorable these little pterosaurs actually were. In addition to the very inaccurate appearance of the pterosaur, it's also rather strange that Anurognathus was included at all in these episodes, considering that it's only known from a geological formation in Germany, and not from the Morrison formation. In the Ballad of Big, Anurognathus is shown scavenging on dinosaur carcasses, which also contradicts what we understand about this species' feeding habits. These pterosaurs show indications that they were well suited to feeding on fast-moving aerial insects in low-light conditions, similar to modern bats and nightjars. They likely didn't spend much time on the ground, as their curved claws look better adapted to clinging onto trees or perching on rock surfaces. So yeah, another very bizarre appearance from Anurognathus, and unfortunately there's not really anything positive I can say about this one. A small lizard is also featured briefly in the episode before Al snaps it up. The Walking With wiki labels it as the genus Paramacellodus, an extinct relative of modern-day skinks and girdled lizards. Now, if there are any lizard experts watching, then please do correct me if I'm wrong, but it looks like the Paramacellodus is being live-acted by a Chinese water dragon here. I'm assuming this species was chosen due to its availability in captivity, but a skink or girdled lizard would have been a better choice considering their closer evolutionary relationship, and a real Paramacellodus would obviously not have looked like this. Still, there were lizards present in the Morrison formation, so it's not entirely inaccurate. Bizarrely, the episode also shows some axolotls in the Morrison formation. Again, these are live-acted by real axolotls, but considering that they are a remarkably unique species endemic to one region of Mexico, it's an odd choice to have them also present in the Jurassic of Wyoming. Perhaps they are just meant to represent juvenile salamanders that have not yet undergone metamorphosis though, as there is a genus of salamander known from the Morrison. Plus, some other amphibian fossils are also known from this formation, mostly of frogs. And just to make sure we cover all the animals shown in the special, we'd better mention the invertebrates featured here too. We see a scorpion and dragonflies in the episode, again live acted. Now, as far as I can tell, and maybe I've missed something here, so please do let me know, I don't seem to be able to find any references to Morrison's scorpion or dragonfly fossils in the literature, so there's not much we can say about them in the episode. Such animals wouldn't necessarily be unexpected to turn up in the Morrison Formation, and there is indeed a lot of trace fossil evidence for invertebrate activity, such as those made by ants, beetles, termites, caddisflies, and others. Turning now to the environment, how does this episode do in terms of its depiction of the Morrison Formation as a whole? Generally, the Morrison environment was a fairly warm and arid place, which paleontologists have likened to a savanna stretching across a vast floodplain, minus the grasses. However, considering the enormous span of time that these rocks represent, as well as the geographic extent of the formation and equivalent strata, underlying 13 different states and 4 Canadian provinces, it's no surprise that it was also rather diverse, featuring a patchwork of different localized environments. Many rivers, lakes, wetlands, and uplands were present across the area, with the most diverse parts of the ecosystems probably being found along riverbanks. Rainfall would have been seasonal, and the mosaic of different habitats across the Morrison Plains likely formed as a result of water availability. The vast floodplain covered by lush conifer forests mentioned in the episode are therefore pretty accurate descriptions of the environment found near the rivers and lakes of the Morrison Formation. The episode also shows some sand dunes, which there is indeed also evidence for, especially in the more southern reaches of the formation. Some smaller dune fields were also present for a while in the central parts of the formation. But what about the salt flat, where the Diplodocus hunt takes place? This sequence was filmed on the Bonneville Salt Flats near Great Salt Lake in Utah. There is actually some geological evidence for the presence of saline lakes in the Morrison Formation, as beds of evaporitic minerals have been located in the southern regions, as well as in northeastern Wyoming. So presumably at certain times of the year, when there were greater rates of evaporation, some of these saline lakes may have dried out and formed salt pans. Overall then, it's really not a bad representation of the Morrison Formation, and it does a good job of showing several of the diverse environments that existed across this extensive region, although obviously featuring a lot of specifically modern day plant species. Considering the episode as a whole, the Ballad of Big really is a fantastic special, continuing with the trend that the original Walking Dinosaurs episodes had of following the life of a particular individual, but then elevating it to a whole other level by really focusing in on this one animal, and actually selecting a real fossil to create the episode around. As I've already stated, I love this concept, and I especially appreciate the use of the pathologies to tell the story of this individual, much as I ended up doing with the fossil that formed the basis of my undergrad research. It's a brilliant way to draw the audience in and really make them feel empathy for this long dead animal, adding an emotional element to the episode and highlighting the fact that every single fossil we find was once a real organism that experienced an entirely unique life. This idea is really emphasized with the opening to the episode, showing Al's ghost next to the skeleton on display. It's a really nice touch and quite emotional. And as I said before, I love the accompanying making of episode that goes into detail about all the science and research. I would have enjoyed it if every Walking Dinosaurs episode had one of these too. Another little detail I just wanted to point out is the interactions some of the animals in this episode have with the camera. The one I particularly love is when one of the hatchling Allosauruses comes right up to the camera and bumps it with its snout. It's a very fun way to make this feel even more like a nature documentary, and that the camera actually has a presence in this world. Once more, the music is just phenomenal in this episode as well, and I have to compliment composer Benjamin Bartlett again, especially for Battle of the Salt Plains. It's just so good. Another fun little fact I wanted to add in here somewhere, this was actually the very first Walking Dinosaurs content that I was alive for, as it aired on Christmas Day in 2000. So that was 17 days after I was born. No clue if I watched it live. Funnily enough though, one of my very earliest memories is of sitting on the sofa with my mum and watching the opening scene to Cruel Seas. I really was destined to be obsessed with prehistoric life from the very start. Anyway, that pretty much brings us to the end of this review. I hope you enjoyed it, and please do let me know if I missed anything out. There was so much to cover with this one, so hopefully I got most of it. Next up, it's onto Walking with Beasts. I'll try to get through them faster than I did with the original Walking with Dinosaurs episodes. Just keep pestering me in the comments until they're done. I know I really should be doing them quicker. Also, we've got an exciting announcement. We are currently deciding what our next prehistoric animal plushie will be. With the success of Swimbo the Spinosaurus, we're teaming up with Plush Foundry again to bring you another plushie. But first, we want to know what you want. There will be a poll up on the posts tab of the channel where you can vote what you most want, so please do head over to there and let us know. I'd also like to say a big thank you to Edge Science for providing me with all this fantastic footage of Big Al that's been featured throughout the episode. Please do be sure to go and subscribe to Edge's channel, it will be linked below. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Please do like this video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed it, and be sure to press that bell icon so you don't miss our next upload, and so you can learn more about our world, its history, and the wonderful life that surrounds us all.